Welcome to the Voices of Sanctuary podcast. This edition of it is with an officer of the National Crime Agency, Robert Richardson, who I will allow to introduce himself in a moment. I'm Rob Dover, I'm Professor of Intelligence and National Security, and we're going to be talking about the law enforcement's role in modern slavery and human trafficking. Rob, thank you for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourself and the role of the agency?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, Rob Richardson. I head up the modern slavery and human trafficking unit within the NCA. What I'll do by kind of introduction is I'll just kind of explain what the NCA is and how we kind of fit in the kind of policing landscape, and then I'll talk a little bit about kind of what my unit does and how we combat modern slavery. The National Crime Agency, which was set up in 2013, was set up to lead the response to serious and organised crime. Although organised crime manifests itself in lots of kind of, different threats, we do see modern slavery and human trafficking as one of our priorities. And so my unit, which is dedicated towards kind of fighting modern slavery, does that through a number of kind of different ways. One is that the NCA has a responsibility to kind of lead what we call the SOC system. So the SOC system is the network of law enforcement kind of agencies that have a kind of some part to play in fighting organised crime, and the NCA leads that response. So we do a certain amount of kind of governance. So this is where we develop what we call a strategic action plan. So we have a modern slavery and human trafficking strategic action plan, which is kind of signed into by all the various different agencies, and we have responsibility for kind of designing that plan, then driving delivery against it. And the other agencies that kind of are part of that plan include all of the kind of police forces in England and Wales, police service, the police in Scotland, the police service in Northern Ireland, as well as HMRC, immigration enforcement, border force, and particularly from a modern slavery perspective, the gang masters and labour abuse authority.
Mm. And with those partners, is it regular meetings? Is it a shared sort of information platform? How does that sort of joint action work?
So it's interesting you mentioned that information platform. We don't have a shared information platform, but what we do have is the ability to kind of share intelligence and information and, where appropriate, kind of evidence with each other. But yeah, a lot of it is through regular kind of meetings, a kind of a network of kind of meetings where senior leaders meet to kind of develop a strategy, but also to kind of we hold other agencies to account for their delivery against the modern slavery threat. So yeah, there's a lot of that kind of governance, and we work closely together. So one of the functions that my unit delivers is that we have a team of dedicated tactical advisors, and these are experienced investigators who have spent a lot of time investigating modern slave offences, so understand how to do that. And we will support our partners. So if you have a criminal investigations led by policing, those tactical advisors will help those leading the investigations with their operational strategy. But the important thing, and I'll come on to a little bit later, when it comes to kind of the law enforcement response, there's also an aspect of that which is around safeguarding victims, which is an important part of our focus.
Well, that segues really nicely into my first substantive question, really, which is to the extent to which the NCA's role is part of a support network for refugees, rather than, as I think the public understanding of it might be, that it's a purely enforcement activity.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, our focus is around combating organised crime, and so as you can imagine, with the NCA, we have a certain amount of kind of what we call niche capability, and so we have a network of officers who operate overseas, and our focus is on organised crime groups that not only kind of exploit victims in the UK, but are also capable of facilitating illegal migration into the UK, but also exploitation on their journey as well. And also there's an aspect of that kind of exploitation to kind of families that are kind of left behind in source countries as well. However, it isn't purely a law enforcement response as well. What we kind of recognise is that with modern slavery, it's relatively unique because when you have a modern slavery offence, there is a victim. And so from a law enforcement perspective, we've got a duty of care to those victims, and we have a responsibility to safeguard them. So an important part of our kind of strategies is to develop an intervention strategy around how we kind of rescue those victims, and then it's signposting the law enforcement effort for those victims to the care that's available to them, to the victim care that's available to them from NGOs, but then kind of facilitating their entry into aspects such as the national referral mechanism. So on a practical basis, that might well be that if we have a criminal investigation that's taking place and we recognise that there are going to be victims that are likely to be rescued, we will help the police set up a reception centre which will ensure that we have somewhere safe to take them, be able to kind of meet their basic needs, and then be able to kind of do two things really. One is to kind of help them get back on their feet. That might be through the national referral mechanism. But the other aspect of it, of course, is that from the law enforcement perspective, we may be that we need to start gathering evidence from them. So we'll be kind of looking at kind of an interview with them to kind of capture that evidence.
And in terms of if they are escaping from dangerous places, and so they've sought sanctuary in the UK, maybe because they have been in compromised positions in their home countries, do you find that it's a barrier to their cooperation, or indeed how they sort of respond to your officers, because they maybe see security forces and law enforcement in their home country and they sort of project it onto the UK? So is there a barrier to that?
So this is a massive barrier that we have. So often, and I know that we'll talk about this a little bit later around how some of the barriers that you kind of have that we have from a law enforcement perspective is that in order to get into the UK in the first place, refugees who may be kind of, as you said, escaping. The motivation could be kind of, could be a multitude of different motivations for doing that. But generally, where we kind of see this is that organised criminality have facilitated their journey into the UK, and what will happen is that they know that they've come into the UK through irregular means or illegal means, and often through clandestine methods of entry. And as a consequence, one of their greatest fears is subsequent deportation, because even if they may find themselves in kind of exploitative situations, they're more frightened of being returned to their home country than they are of being kind of than they are of their exploiters, and so that's a kind of a massive barrier.
And to that extent, is that how these people manage to, or sort of end up being wrapped in or involved with organised crime gangs in the UK?
Yeah, so this is the thing, is that it could be fleeing conflict. They might be seeking kind of economic opportunities in the UK, but what will happen is organised crime prey on them. Victims will pay for criminals to facilitate their entry into the UK, and that creates a debt. And so that sort of debt bondage is one of the biggest drivers for keeping control of victims, and that coercion is a really important kind of aspect of modern slavery. Is that victims, refugees, however we want to describe these people, will have significant debts, and those debts will not only be kind of payable here, but also their families will kind of have those debts to the organised crime groups, and that's how the crime groups kind of exert their control.
And those debts, will they be accruing interest? So, would that individual ever be able to get themselves out of that debt, or is that a sort of a debt that's assumed to be, in your experience, sort of for life in inverted commas? And if that
So
person happens to die en route, is that debt still payable by their family in from the host country?
that's right, and we actually, it's interesting. One of the things that we learned during the COVID um, pandemic was that where we see modern slavery in the UK often is in car washes, nail bars, the restaurant trade, entertainment. Now, all of those that were kind of very public facing all closed down during the pandemic. So it led us to an interesting question about kind of, well, what happens to victims in those circumstances? Would they be, I mean, if they could no longer make money for the people who are exploiting them, will their traffickers release them? And so would we see, an increase in people claiming benefits or an increase in people on the streets? Well, no, we didn't. And our working hypothesis was actually that they would then move into different sectors. So the food supply chain continued during the lockdown. And so, what we saw was some of those victims kind of moving into different sectors. But the control for those who weren't able to continue to work, though, so for example, those that were working in the sex industry, who were being sexually exploited, who were unable to work because there was no ability for kind of to contact. What we saw was that their debts would be increased. So they would kind of pay for their accommodation, or say they were paying for their accommodation, pay to feed them, and that would just add to their debt. So we saw some of that, and we do see that as well. That for some victims that are in chronic situations that are being exploited for significant periods of time, they never ever pay their debts off. However, and there's an interesting aspect of it. One of the nationalities that suffers, that we see the most of, that enter into the NRM, that are kind of victims of trafficking, is the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese diaspora is really interesting because they do come into the UK, they do use organised crime to facilitate their entry, and they do work in exploitative conditions. However, they are able to do that for a finite period of time, are able to send money back home, and are then able to return once they have kind of paid off their debt and earned enough money. So that's kind of relatively unique, but relatively unique to the Vietnamese diaspora.
Is that because of cultural conditions in Vietnam, or the particular sorts of facilitating gangs that they join up with to be trafficked to the UK?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. And when we look at the Vietnamese economy, for example, that's an important part of the culture. So there's a familial expectation that people kind of leave Vietnam to go and earn money elsewhere, and so it's a system that works for them. However, when we identify Vietnamese victims, they are in exploitative situations, whether they kind of recognise that or not.
So how difficult then is it to differentiate between a perpetrator and a victim in that circumstances? And is there a typical way to deal with someone who may fit into both categories at the same time, which it sounds like your Vietnamese example here might well do?
Yeah, and where that really manifests itself is kind of when we encounter irregular migrants when they first get into the UK. So a really good example of this is that we're seeing, the prevalence of high risk clandestine methods of entry. So, notwithstanding the tragic events in Purfleet in 2019, we're also seeing, a significant amount of kind of migration using the small boats methodology. And, there have been some tragic incidents there. Now, when we kind of so we work closely with immigration enforcement and border force and policing, and so it's interesting to kind of just to recognise that again, the NCA's role is looking at the organised crime that facilitates that activity, but immigration enforcement, border force, policing will be the first responders. And what will happen is that there will be a mixture of, you'll have people there who are facilitating the illegal migration. you will have victims of trafficking, and you will have people who are trying to smuggle themselves into the country. And there's no way in that initial when they're initially encountered to be able to differentiate between them. So because on the face of it, an immigration offence has occurred. Immigration enforcement, border force policing will kind of detain those people, but then subsequently, once they're in a kind of a place of safety, there will be a kind of an interview to be able to kind of identify their circumstances behind their entry into the UK. And it's often the interesting kind of aspect of that is about the victim's ability to be able to kind of recognise themselves as victims. And so it's only through that kind of that debriefing, those kind of conversations, and the ability to kind of have those conversations, so have the right people with the right skills, have the people with the right language skills, to be able to explain to them that the rights once they've kind of got into the UK, allows us then to be able to make some decisions about identifying those that are victims of trafficking and those that are facilitating people smuggling.
That's interesting, and you may well have covered this sort of next question in the answer to the previous one, I guess. But what are the key challenges in prosecuting modern slavery and human trafficking offences?
So, when it comes to kind of gathering evidence, the most compelling evidence is the evidence that you get from the victims themselves. However, one of the biggest challenges we have is keeping them engaged during the prosecution. So often, the criminal justice system can take quite a long time. So the gathering of kind of further evidence, and particularly if we're looking at sophisticated organised crime groups, which is where, from an NCA perspective, that's definitely our focus. Keeping the victims engaged is difficult. Often, the victims may choose to be repatriated. So if they are not escaping conflict, for example, but have been kind of coerced into coming into the UK, or there's been some other kind of force, they want to go back home, then we kind of lose that ability to kind of bring those victims to be able to provide evidence in court. But the thing is that modern slavery is incredibly complex. There's so many kind of different kind of facets of it that what works really well, and I kind of go back to my kind of opening statement about the NCA's role, is that there's a requirement to bring the resources from different law enforcement agencies together to be able to kind of so it's not just down to kind of one particular agency. We need to kind of work closely together. So as you can imagine, coordinating that response kind of adds to the complexity. But often what you have is you've got victims for whom we don't necessarily have the same. There's language barriers. They're incredibly vulnerable, and they're more often than not they will have experienced a significant trauma. And so trying to kind of persuade people in that circumstance to kind of give evidence in court is often a challenge. And then similarly, we have issues around kind of disclosure. The volume of material that's required to be able to kind of convince a jury of a modern slavery offence could be so great, and there's a requirement for that to kind of come from overseas to be translated, kind of adds to the complexity. So what we have is a crime that is kind of resource intensive to be able to fight. There is a significant investment required to be able to safeguard the victims, and so the response that's required as well kind of just adds to that complexity.
And on that basis, I mean, is it akin to excuse me, is it akin to a fraud trial? The sort of classic example of the Maxwell brothers in the 90s, where the trials went on for months and months and months. In fact, in that case, I think it went on for years. But is it the level of complexity that actually you can not tie up the courts, but you occupy the courts for months at a time, or am I overthinking how complex these are?
No. So I think a good example. We have an operation. We had a kind of a prosecution where the offending took place in 2017, and we're only just at the stage now where we have reached the end of that criminal justice system. We've been successful with the prosecution, but now we're at the stage where we're looking at kind of criminal confiscation, and that's taken 4 years, and that was for one defendant. The complexity was that the defendant was based in the UK, but the trafficking took place between Nigeria and Italy. And so, gathering witness statements, gathering material from the various different jurisdictions just built-in delays. And so whilst those delays continued, being able to kind of get evidence from the victims, which is the most compelling evidence, slowed down the whole process. So yeah, absolutely, it can be incredibly complex and can take a really long time as well.
Yeah, feel free to ignore these these sort of like two questions. But I wondered whether, like, on the basis of what you've said, whether you feel optimistic about this area of sort of activity and area of law enforcement, and also, is it an area that, so I listen to what you're saying, and you obviously deal with lots of victims, and you deal with sort of almost like the dark side of life in terms of what people are willing to do to other people in terms of enslaving and all the rest of it, and violence against them. Whether it sort of weighs heavily on you, or whether you're able to kind of bunker away or stovepipe away those sorts of day-to-day, almost like the work side, and then, or does it sort of leak into how you think about the rest of life?
So it's interesting. So you're probably kind of sort of talking about kind of my personal motivation, but also the motivation of the team. So I think anybody who kind of chooses to kind of pursue a career in law enforcement, I think does it for the right reasons. That's, protecting the public. And so when you look at crimes such as these, which is exploiting the vulnerable, so it's not just kind of modern slavery, it's kind of people smuggling, child sexual exploitation, those kind of offences does require a certain mindset. But I guess that if you feel as if you're making an impact with the people who are most vulnerable, then you feel as if you kind of I don't know. There's something about a certain amount of job satisfaction, because that's kind of what you're there to do. You're there to protect those that are most vulnerable. But you asked that question really, and one of the things that actually is really important is that one of my experiences of working in this environment is that everybody else who does work in this environment chooses to do so and have a genuine reason for doing it. It's just a kind of a side note is that whenever I need to recruit new people into my unit, I have a really kind of easy task, because there is a significant number of people who want to work here, and then I get to kind of choose the real kind of high quality people, and they genuinely want to do the work because they're interested in it, but they do it for the right reason, because they want to make a difference. And so I'm surrounded by highly competent and motivated people. So that gives me kind of pause to kind of think that there is I can't remember the exact phrase that I think you said, can I be optimistic? And I think that I can be optimistic as long as there is people that I surround myself with. And that's not just in the NCA, that's with our partner agencies, kind of are motivated to kind of, protect those people who are most vulnerable. With regards to kind of the ability for law enforcement to kind of fight this crime, so the Home Office are reviewing the modern slavery strategy. So that modern slavery strategy was written in 2014. And in the very early days, you had things like the Prime Minister's task force, when Theresa May was leading on that issue, which brought around a lot of investment and set up things such as my unit, as well as the Modern Slavery Police Transformation Unit, and also saw the drafting of the Modern Slavery Act. So that strategy is up for review, and I think that one of the things that we do lack is that kind of leadership from government, and so the strategy is an opportunity for us to kind of review what we need to be able to continue to fight the crime. So I'm kind of optimistic that with that strategy, it'll give us an opportunity to kind of review what works well and to be able to do more of that.
Well, that's a great answer, and it really nicely segues into my final question, really, which is if I could gift you a set of capabilities, sort of tools or remedies to help improve the situation regarding modern slavery and human trafficking, what would they be?
Yeah, so from a law enforcement perspective, and I'm going to start again with a bit of a barrier. So and this is really important for me from the NCA, is about a coordinated response. So what we find is that police forces will identify victims of trafficking in their force and will start to kind of investigate it. But their interest in that will probably stop once they have safeguarded the victims, which is probably about right, because it's a victim-centred approach. However, with all modern slavery, there's an organised crime group that sits behind it, and that will be a network. They'll be part of a wider network. And what we need is the police to be able to kind of not just to investigate and sort of safeguard those victims, is also to kind of investigate that wider network. So we have done some work to do that. So an important part of the NCA's work is to coordinate that policing response. But one of the things that kind of works really well, but we don't have at present, is dedicated modern slavery investigation teams. So the NCA doesn't have one, for example, and some of the largest forces in the country don't have dedicated modern slavery investigation teams. And so that would be, and again, it comes down to resourcing. So what we kind of, if you give me that as a Christmas present, it would be, the ability to set up dedicated modern slavery teams where you have trained investigators who understand modern slavery, understand how to safeguard victims, but are then kind of driven to investigate the modern state, the organised crime that sits behind it, and then allows agencies such as mine, the NCA, to join the dots between those significant organised crime groups, those that are highly sophisticated, and those that engage in organised immigration crime. Failing that, it's about training. It's about education. So it's about training investigators to understand how to investigate modern slavery. But actually, an important part of it is raising awareness with the public. So that's why I'm really keen to speak to people such as yourself, is that it's really important that we raise the issues so that people understand it. We talk about, this sounds cliched, but it's true that modern slavery is kind of hidden in plain sight. And so it's about being able to equip the public with an understanding of how modern slavery manifests itself, and that they then know what to do about it. And then the third thing is probably around industry doing more to combat modern slavery. And we are starting to see that industry, particularly kind of supermarkets and their suppliers, are looking at their supply chains to identify and combat modern slavery there. But I think that industry could do more. There's a section of the Modern Slavery Act, which is Section 54, which compels large companies to publish a modern slavery statement. Well, we want them to go further and actually kind of root out modern slavery in their supply chains and make kind of different decisions about, who their suppliers are and where they buy from. And that goes with the public as well. What we want the public to do is to actually think about their consumer decisions and have a think about kind of, where there is likely to, where there will be modern slavery that exists there, and make consumer choices based upon that knowledge. So these are some of the things that we kind of need to do better.
Yeah, that's great. And just on that last point, so if we use again the example of nail bars, how does a discriminating consumer get to the bottom of whether the nail bar that they are going to go to have their nails done has employees that are legitimately there, happy to be there, not coerced under some sort of debt bondage? How might they go and do that? Because obviously they won't have the investigative tools that you've got.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the first kind of indicator is the cost of the service that's being provided, and we've kind of said this. You mentioned fraud earlier on. That with fraud, often if it sounds too good to be true, it usually isn't, and it's the same with these kind of public-facing sectors. If you go to get your nails done, and you get it done for kind of £5, and the service is there for kind of 45 minutes, and they do a great job with your nails, you ask yourself the question, how is this company making a profit? And it's usually because it's not paying its workers. So that's the really simplest and obvious kind of indicator. But with nail bars, what you will have is staff, the people who are kind of providing the service. Do they engage? Do you kind of get a sense that these people have something going on in their lives other than kind of doing somebody's nails? Are they, some really obvious things about, are they clean? Are there any kind of signs of any kind of violence that you can see? There is a kind of a whole range of kind of indicators that people look for, but the most obvious one is around the cost of the service. There's a number of kind of initiatives that are kind of helping the public to do that. So, for example, in the car wash industry, which is another area that's rife with exploitation, there's an organisation called the Q Initiative, which is the Church of England's kind of response to kind of modern slavery. They've produced something called the Safer Car Wash app, and that is, you go to a kind of car wash, and if you kind of go and you find that they're going to kind of give a full valet to your SUV, and they're going to charge £5 for it. The app allows you to kind of look at other indicators around, the safety equipment that have been provided for the workers, as I mentioned previously, the cost of the service, how you kind of visually see the workers being treated. And, there's a whole kind of list of questions they can go through. And then once they kind of tick those kind of boxes on the app, they can then make a referral into the modern slavery helpline, for example. So, but the easiest and simplest way is just the cost of things. The garment industry is a really interesting one. And there was well documented last summer, particularly around kind of allegations of exploitation in the garment sector in Leicester. And again, when you look at kind of fast fashions and you see clothing that costs £3, there's the question you've got to ask yourself: how does a company make a profit on goods that cost that little? And often it will well be either labour abuse or labour exploitation.
That's very true, and good advice too. Well, they were my questions, Rob, and it's been an absolute delight to talk to you, and I found that really interesting. And I would expect that people listening to it will as well, because it's a perspective that we don't often get to hear. So it's really good of you to spend the time talking to us about it.
No problem at all.
Thank you.